The air in Cleveland's Cudell Recreation Center is calm. The sun barely touches the pavement. Children run across the playground. Parents watch from benches, and the rhythm of a normal Saturday afternoon hums softly. But in the blink of an eye, normal will vanish. Tamir Rice is 12 years old. He is a boy with energy, imagination, and a toy, a realistic-looking airsoft pistol he has been playing with. It's bright orange at the tip, unmistakably fake if you look closely, but in the eyes of the world trained to see threat before context, it will mean nothing. Tamir is underestimated in the most tragic way possible, not as a threat, but as a human being deserving of a moment to be seen as a child. A 911 call is made. "Someone is pointing a gun at people," says the voice on the line. Within seconds, the script of violence has begun. 2 police officers, trained to respond to danger, are dispatched. What happens next will be dissected endlessly in courtrooms, in newsrooms, and in the hearts of a grieving city. But for Tamir, there is no chance to explain, no chance to demonstrate innocence. The officers arrive in a patrol car. Within seconds of seeing Tamir, moving, playful, a boy on a playground, one officer decides he is a threat. No words are exchanged. No warning is given. Within 2 seconds of contact, a firearm is discharged. Tamir Rice collapses, a child, bleeding in a place meant for laughter. The dramatic irony is brutal. A toy becomes evidence of danger, a child becomes a suspect, and a neighborhood becomes a crime scene. Witnesses scream. Parents rush toward him. The police retreat to procedural distance. The world watches through shaky smartphone cameras and news footage. And in those moments, a life is stolen by perception before reality has a chance to speak. The city reacts with shock and grief. Tamir's parents are left to navigate pain so raw, so incomprehensible, it cannot be contained in court documents or news reports. A boy who could have grown up to be anything, an athlete, a scholar, a friend, becomes a symbol of what happens when assumptions outweigh humanity. The officer's narrative is clear from the beginning. The boy looked dangerous, the officer reacted to threat, the law required split-second judgment. And yet, the evidence, the 911 call, the footage, the bright orange tip of the airsoft gun, paints a more complicated picture. The child was never a threat. The system, trained to protect, failed to account for innocence. The first power shift emerges in public perception. While the legal system moves slowly, public outrage spreads like wildfire. Social media lights up. Community groups organize. Activists protest. The world begins to question not just what happened to Tamir, but why a child could be judged as a deadly threat before anyone could intervene. The outrage is a mirror held up to authority. The people see a failure the system refuses to admit. Court cases follow. Officer Timothy Lohman is tried, not for malice, but for failure to exercise judgment according to the law as it interprets split-second decision-making. Evidence is dissected. The toy gun is held as proof of innocence, but the system asks whether perception, not reality, governs action. The tension tightens. Dramatic irony cuts deep. The boy is gone, yet the man who shot him faces a legal system designed to protect him. The verdict arrives. No charges. Not guilty. Procedural justification is cited. The system, once again, shields the powerful while those most vulnerable pay the ultimate price. Yet outside the courtroom, the power balance begins to shift. Tamir becomes a catalyst. His name joins a long list of victims whose deaths force America to confront systemic bias, racial profiling, and the rush to lethal force. Communities across the nation begin to demand change. Policy reforms, body cameras, and officer training protocols are debated and revised. Tamir Rice, in death, forces the system to see its own blind spots, to reckon with the consequences of acting before thinking, of fearing before knowing. The life lesson is clear. Justice is not only about accountability, it is about preventing tragedy before it happens, about valuing life over assumptions. Yet the irony remains. The law protects the officer. The public mourns the child. The debate rages. The structural power is unchanged, even as perception begins to shift. Tamir Rice's story becomes a touchstone, a reminder that policy cannot move fast enough to save innocence when fear drives action. The emotional hook lingers in the simplest, most devastating detail. Tamir was a child, 12 years old, playing, alive until a moment when the world chose threat over humanity. And in that, The audience feels the tension, the injustice, and the sorrow that never fully resolves. And then comes the cliffhanger for part 2. How does a society ensure this never happens again? Can systemic change truly protect those most vulnerable, or will assumptions and split-second fears continue to steal lives? The answer is not yet written. The struggle continues. Tamir Rice's story ends not in courtroom closure, but in moral reckoning. It leaves the audience with a profound sense of grief, anger, and the urgent responsibility to question authority, to witness truth, and to demand justice before tragedy strikes again. The final emotional beat. The child who was judged in an instant is remembered forever. Not as a statistic, not as a footnote, but as a life that challenged a system, exposed its flaws, and forced a nation to confront the cost of prejudice, fear, and haste. And that cost remains unpaid. The life lesson is clear. The value of human life cannot be replaced by procedure or perception. Every split-second judgment carries consequences that ripple far beyond one moment. Justice is not only about punishment, it is about vigilance, empathy, and reform. Part 2 promises to explore the aftermath. How the Rice family fought for recognition, how public outrage forced policy debates, and whether a nation can ever truly learn from the mistakes that cost a child his life. But for now, the question remains, how many more Tamirs will be judged before humanity sees them first? When the initial shock faded, the questions remained, heavy and unrelenting. 12-year-old Tamir Rice had been shot within seconds of being seen by police. His life extinguished so fast that the word child barely had time to register. The nation mourned, but mourning was not enough. Tamir's death exposed a system that judged fear over fact, reaction over reason. And in that exposure, the fight for justice began, not just in courtrooms, but in communities, in homes, and in the hearts of everyone watching. Tamir's parents were left to navigate grief while the public dissected their child's life on national television. Every detail became evidence, every statement a potential weapon. The world wanted answers, but answers were slow, procedural, and often cold. The Cleveland Police Department, along with the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office, launched investigations. Officer Timothy Lohman, the man who pulled the trigger, was placed on administrative leave, a phrase that sounds like accountability but in practice feels like a pause, a holding pattern, a shield from scrutiny. The irony was immediate and sharp. The boy was dead, yet the officer was protected by the very system that failed to protect him. Within this tension, the first major power shift began, not in courtrooms, not in verdicts, but in public perception. Social media lit up as ordinary citizens became witnesses. Videos, images, and news clips circulated endlessly. Hashtags like #JusticeForTamir and #BlackLivesMatter began to take shape, connecting the dots between Tamir's death and countless other cases where black children and adults were perceived as threats before they were recognized as human beings. The narrative had shifted. The public now held power in the form of awareness. Visibility became a weapon, and for the first time, the people demanded that the system answer, not for procedural correctness, but for morality. Yet the legal system moved slowly, methodically. Prosecutors deliberated over whether Officer Lohman had reasonable belief that Tamir posed a threat. They dissected the 911 call, the toy gun, the body camera footage. Each frame, each word, each second was examined as if removing human context could produce fairness. The dramatic irony cut deep. A boy who could not speak for himself became the center of a legal debate about perception, judgment, and what constitutes a threat. The system, in trying to prove innocence or guilt, treated a child's life as an object lesson in law enforcement doctrine rather than a human tragedy demanding justice. The Rice family hired attorneys, advocates, and publicists. They became warriors not just for Tamir, but for the principle that a child's life should be treated with care and dignity. Each press conference, each courtroom appearance, each interview was a reminder that the fight for justice would not be confined to evidence alone. It had to be fought in the court of public opinion, in the conscience of a nation, and in the policies that govern law enforcement. The weight of this responsibility fell not on the officers or the state alone. It fell on the parents of a child who was never meant to be in a courtroom for his own life. Public protests erupted across Cleveland and beyond. Citizens held signs, marched in streets, and chanted Tamir's name. Each demonstration was a reminder that the tragedy of one child was a reflection of a broader pattern. A system quick to assume threat in black bodies and slow to act when innocence needed protection. The irony remained bitter. Power, which had once decided Tamir's fate in a split second, now faced a relentless challenge from the very community it was meant to serve. Meanwhile, Officer Lohman resigned from the Cleveland Police Department, a decision framed as a voluntary exit rather than punishment. The legal system moved toward a grand jury, but the public remained skeptical. In the courtroom, arguments centered on procedural technicalities. Whether he acted according to department training, whether he perceived danger in split seconds. Outside, the world saw a child shot while playing, a life cut short, and a family shattered. This juxtaposition fueled outrage. Dramatic irony layered over grief. The law defended perception, the public mourned reality. The story shifted into civil litigation. Tamir's family filed a wrongful death suit against the city of Cleveland. Unlike the criminal system, civil court offered some measure of resolution, a recognition that a child's death demanded acknowledgement, if not justice in the criminal sense. The city eventually settled for $6 million, a figure that, while significant, could never restore what had been lost. The settlement was framed as closure, but the emotional wounds remained raw, unhealed, and unquantifiable. Even as policies were debated, training protocols, use of force regulations, body camera requirements, the structural inequities that allowed Tamir's death to occur were far from resolved. Authority had shifted slightly. Police departments across the nation were now under scrutiny, awareness of racial bias became more mainstream, and communities demanded transparency. But the fundamental imbalance remained. The system still valued perception over humanity in split-second encounters, and the lesson that Tamir's life offered could easily be ignored if public vigilance waned. The power of one child to ignite awareness was unprecedented. Tamir Rice became more than a victim, he became a symbol. His story forced Americans to confront uncomfortable truths. A child could be judged as dangerous in an instant, a toy could become evidence of threat, and authority could act with lethal force before innocence was even considered. Yet this symbolic power carried an emotional weight that no settlement, no policy, and no public statement could erase. Tamir's family and the nation were left to wrestle with grief that never ended. The photographs of Tamir, smiling and playful, juxtaposed against the scene of his death. The empty playground he once ran across. The echoes of what should have been a life instead remembered as a tragedy. Every viewer feels the tension, the mix of sorrow, rage, and helplessness that authority and procedure cannot fully justify. The story ends with a suspenseful, unresolved question. How can a nation prevent a tragedy like Tamir's from happening again? Can reforms truly protect those most vulnerable, or will split-second judgments and systemic bias continue to determine who lives and who dies? The lesson is heavy. Justice is not only about punishment, it is about creating systems that safeguard life before tragedy strikes. Part 2 leaves the audience with a complex mixture of grief, outrage, and hope. Grief for the child whose life was stolen. Outrage at a system that allowed it. Hope in the collective awareness that could force change. And the cliffhanger is clear. The fight continues. Will society learn from Tamir Rice, or will his story become yet another statistic in a history of preventable deaths? The dramatic irony remains. The child who could not defend himself now carries the weight of systemic accountability. The power shift is not complete. It is ongoing, fragile, and dependent on those who continue to demand justice. And as the screen fades to black, the audience is left with one haunting question. If one child's death could expose the flaws in a system, how many more lives will it take before true accountability and protection are finally achieved? Part 3 promises to follow the long-term impact. Policy debates, nationwide protests, body camera reforms, and the ways Tamir Rice's legacy shapes the fight against systemic injustice today. The world never truly recovers from a tragedy like Tamir Rice. One child, shot within seconds, becomes a symbol whose presence lingers long after headlines fade. While the legal system debated split-second judgments and reasonable perception, the public had already moved beyond the courtroom. They demanded answers that law alone could not provide. Answers about morality, bias, and the kind of society that could mistake a toy for a weapon and a child for a threat. Tamir's parents, Samaria and Leonard Rice, became reluctant warriors. Their grief was raw, unfiltered, and immeasurable. Yet they faced a world that expected composure, demanded evidence, and required proof of loss beyond human understanding. Every press conference, every interview, every civil suit was an attempt to hold authority accountable. But authority is patient. It can wait. And grief is a battlefield with no clear enemy. Still, the Rice family refused to allow their child's life to vanish into silence. They fought not only for recognition but for systemic change. The public's reaction was immediate and visceral. Social media amplified grief and outrage. Hashtags like #JusticeForTamir and #BlackLivesMatter became rallying cries, and demonstrations spread across the nation. People marched, chanted, and held vigils. The emotional tension of these gatherings was palpable. They were fueled not only by anger at a child's death, but by the awareness that this was not an isolated event. Patterns had emerged across the country. Black children perceived as threats, shot before their innocence could be recognized. The dramatic irony was devastating. Authority had judged Tamir in an instant, but now society was judging authority, and the consequences of that judgment were only beginning to unfold. Meanwhile, policy debates began. Cleveland police faced scrutiny over training, use of force protocols, and officer recruitment practices. Across the nation, other departments examined similar policies. Some implemented stricter rules regarding split-second use of deadly force, mandatory de-escalation training, and body camera oversight. The power shift was subtle but undeniable. Public awareness now had teeth. It demanded transparency and accountability that had previously been optional. What began as tragedy had evolved into a force for potential reform. Yet the road to justice remained incomplete. Officer Timothy Lohman was never criminally charged, leaving a bitter void in the legal sense of accountability. Civil suits could compensate financially but not restore life or innocence. The structural inequities that allowed Tamir's death to occur were only partially addressed. Qualified immunity, the same policies that shielded Lohman, remained intact in many jurisdictions. And the tension persisted. Systems can change incrementally, but patterns of bias and fear are far more stubborn. The emotional resonance of Tamir's story, the loss, the grief, the injustice, remained unresolved. The Rice family's civil suit against the city of Cleveland resulted in a $6 million settlement, described by many as a recognition of responsibility. Yet no amount of money could replace a child's life, and the settlement was only a partial victory. The lesson for the audience is clear. Justice is not always measured in dollars or verdicts. Sometimes it is measured in awareness, in policy shifts, in the pressure exerted on systems that have long relied on silence to maintain power. Tamir's legacy, however, was larger than courtroom outcomes. He became the catalyst for national dialogue about racial profiling, police training, and the split-second decisions that could end a life. He transformed public perception. Citizens learned that witnesses, cameras, and outrage could create real-world consequences for actions that might otherwise go unpunished. The dramatic irony remains. The child who could not speak for himself became the voice that reshaped how authority is observed and evaluated. Across the country, communities took note. Grassroots organizations demanded reform. Activists highlighted the use of body cameras, the importance of de-escalation techniques, and the necessity of holding law enforcement accountable not only for gross misconduct but also for errors rooted in bias. Tamir Rice became more than a victim. He became a measure of progress, or the lack thereof. Every case that mirrored his story referenced him. Every policy discussion cited his name. His death became a mirror in which the nation saw both its failures and its potential. The emotional impact of this legacy cannot be overstated. Viewers, whether in Cleveland or across the globe, are confronted with the harsh truth. A child's life was stolen within moments, and yet the responsibility to prevent the next tragedy lies in the hands of adults, systems, and society itself. The tension between grief and action, outrage and hope, becomes the story's driving force. The audience is not a passive observer. It becomes a witness, an advocate, and a participant in the ongoing reckoning. Yet, even as awareness grows, the cliffhanger of Part 3 remains painfully real. How do we ensure that lessons learned from Tamir Rice's death are not forgotten? How do we prevent the next child from being judged as a threat in the instant of perception? Systems can be rewritten, policies reformed, but fear and bias are far harder to legislate away. The dramatic irony lingers. The tools for justice exist, yet implementation lags behind tragedy. The story closes on an emotional note, focusing not on numbers or policies but on human consequence. The playground where Tamir once played remains empty in memory. Photos of his smile, of him holding a toy gun, of him running freely under the sun, are stark reminders of life cut short. The audience is left with grief, anger, and reflection. They are reminded that systemic change requires vigilance, that awareness alone is insufficient, and that the fight for justice is never truly complete. Tamir Rice's legacy challenges every viewer. to see clearly, to speak loudly, and to act decisively when systems fail those most vulnerable. His story does not end with a settlement or a verdict. It continues in every policy debate, every protest, every conversation about how society protects, or fails to protect, its children. And the final question, hanging in the air as the screen fades to black: if one child's death could awaken a nation, how many more must suffer before true justice is enforced? Part 4 will explore nationwide reforms, the evolution of police accountability in the years after Tamir Rice, and the continuing struggle to ensure that systemic bias does not claim another innocent life. But for now, the story remains unfinished, a powerful reminder that awareness without action is not enough, and that justice, in its truest form, is still waiting to be realized. The death of Tamir Rice was a spark that refused to die. From the playground where he fell, from the photographs of a 12-year-old boy with an orange-tipped toy gun, from the streets of Cleveland to the offices of lawmakers and police chiefs across the nation, his story traveled. It became a mirror, a stark reflection of a system that could act decisively to kill a child but hesitated to reform. In the months and years following Tamir's death, the nation began a slow and painful conversation about policing, racial bias, and accountability. Cleveland, under immense public scrutiny, introduced new policies. Officers received updated use of force training, body cameras were mandated, and protocols for responding to calls involving minors were reviewed. Across the country, departments studied the Cleveland case as a cautionary tale. Civil rights organizations demanded legislation to address systemic failures, arguing that one child's death should never be repeated. The first major power shift was subtle but profound. Authority, once insulated from public perception, now faced constant oversight. Smartphones, social media, and citizen journalism created a new accountability landscape. Every time a call was made, every time a camera rolled, law enforcement knew the public was watching. This was Tamir Rice's unintentional but enduring influence. Though he could not speak, his life became a warning. The people would not remain silent. Yet awareness alone could not heal the wounds. The Rice family, though financially compensated through a civil settlement, remained haunted by the absence of justice in the criminal system. Officer Timothy Lohman, whose split-second decision ended Tamir's life, faced no criminal conviction. The legal system's protections for authority, qualified immunity, and the doctrine of split-second judgment remained intact, highlighting a cruel imbalance. The public had gained awareness, but the structures that failed Tamir persisted. National conversations intensified. Activists cited Tamir Rice alongside Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, and other young African Americans whose lives were ended prematurely. These cases created a growing chorus demanding systemic change. Body cameras, independent oversight boards, racial bias training, de-escalation tactics, and reforms in how emergency calls are assessed. Each policy discussion, each news segment, each protest invoked Tamir's name, ensuring that the child who was judged as a threat within seconds would not be forgotten. The dramatic irony remained. A nation had the evidence, the visibility, and the outrage, yet structural reform moved painfully slowly. Systems adapted incrementally. Policies were updated. Officer trainings improved. But fear, bias, and procedural loopholes still created space for tragedy. Tamir Rice's death exposed a systemic flaw, but exposing flaws alone cannot rebuild life or prevent the next crisis. Despite the slow pace, his legacy brought small but meaningful victories. Police departments across the United States incorporated new protocols for responding to calls involving minors. Officers were trained to recognize the developmental differences between children and adults. De-escalation techniques were emphasized over immediate force. These changes, while imperfect, marked a subtle shift in power. The public now influenced policy in ways that were impossible before the age of viral video and social media scrutiny. Tamir's family became symbols of perseverance. Their advocacy transformed grief into action, and their persistence ensured that policymakers could no longer ignore the consequences of inaction. They demanded more than procedural fixes. They demanded acknowledgement that children, particularly black children, could not be assumed to be threats. Their fight illuminated a harsh reality. Justice for one child does not automatically prevent harm to the next. The nation watched as these reforms began to take hold, but every victory was shadowed by the knowledge that the system could, and often did, fail again. Each new case reminded the public of the stakes. Videos of children mistaken for threats continued to surface, showing that while policies could change on paper, cultural and systemic biases are far harder to dismantle. Tamir Rice's story became a benchmark, a standard by which subsequent tragedies were judged, and a lens through which Americans measured progress, or the lack of it. The emotional weight of this legacy cannot be overstated. Tamir's death was not just a statistic, it was a catalyst. His life and untimely death forced a nation to confront uncomfortable truths about race, childhood, and authority. Parents across the country felt the urgency of his story personally. They imagined their own children judged as dangerous within seconds, and the fear galvanized advocacy, awareness, and activism. The audience, whether through grief, anger, or reflection, was compelled to act, to demand a society where innocence is preserved and life is valued above assumptions. Yet the suspense remained. The reforms, as promising as they were, did not guarantee that the next call would end differently. Awareness and policy changes could influence behavior, but systemic bias and fear operate independently of legislation. Each new report of police violence reminded the nation that the work was ongoing, unfinished, and fragile. The power dynamic had shifted, but it had not been resolved. Authority now faced scrutiny, but the tools for reform were still under construction. Tamir Rice's story concludes this chapter not with justice as closure, but with justice as vigilance. The life lesson is clear, and it resonates deeply. It is not enough to mourn tragedy, one must act to prevent it. In a society where split-second judgments can end a child's life, awareness must be combined with action. True justice requires structural reform, accountability, and a commitment to valuing human life over assumptions. The final emotional beat emphasizes the human cost. The playground where Tamir once laughed remains a place of memory, a reminder of what was lost. His photographs, smiling and full of life, juxtaposed against the tragic scene of his death, create a tension that is almost unbearable to witness. The audience is left with grief, sorrow, and reflection. They understand that justice cannot be measured in verdicts alone. It is measured in lives protected, in bias challenged, and in a society vigilant enough to learn from its failures. And the cliffhanger for the audience remains. If one child's death can awaken a nation, how many more must fall before systemic change is fully realized? The story ends with a call to awareness and action. Tamir Rice's legacy is not complete. It demands vigilance, empathy, and persistent engagement. The reforms in place may save lives, but they are only as strong as the public's willingness to enforce them. In this final part, the lesson echoes across time. Being seen is not enough. Witnessing injustice is necessary, but preventing it is the real challenge. Tamir Rice's life, cut tragically short, became a voice for countless others. His story is a reminder that humanity must act decisively when systems fail, that policy is only meaningful when enforced, and that every child deserves the chance to be recognized first as innocent, and only then as anything else. As the screen fades, the emotional resonance lingers. Grief and hope, sorrow and responsibility, awareness and action. Tamir Rice's story has become immortal, not in headlines or statistics, but in the conscience of a nation that continues to wrestle with its own failures and the imperative to change. And the ultimate question remains, haunting and unresolved. When the next child is judged as a threat, will the nation remember Tamir Rice? Will it act before tragedy strikes again, or will history repeat itself? Years have passed since that quiet afternoon in Cleveland when Tamir Rice, 12 years old, fell to the ground, shot within seconds of being seen as a threat. The playground where he once ran freely remains silent in memory, yet his story continues to echo across America, across headlines, across generations. What happened to Tamir is not just a moment in time. It is a reflection of systemic failures, a measure of societal bias, and a call to action that refuses to fade. The Rice family's fight for justice did not end with settlements or policy discussions. Their pursuit became relentless, not merely for recognition, but to prevent another family from enduring the unimaginable grief of losing a child to split-second judgments. Samaria and Leonard Rice channeled their anguish into advocacy, testifying before lawmakers, speaking at rallies, and partnering with civil rights organizations to create awareness. Their grief became a public force, forcing the system to confront its failures and pushing citizens to demand accountability. National awareness intensified. Tamir's story became a benchmark for understanding racial bias, policing, and the use of deadly force. Scholars, activists, and journalists examined the case, dissecting every moment, every decision, every institutional failure. His death became the lens through which the nation measured reform. Could policy, training, and oversight prevent the next tragedy? The answer remained uncertain. Awareness had grown, but enforcement lagged. Dramatic irony hung heavy. One child's death had galvanized a movement, yet the structures that killed him remained largely unchanged in many places. Police departments across the country introduced reforms inspired by Tamir Rice. Officers received updated training on interacting with minors, de-escalation techniques were emphasized, and the deployment of body cameras became more common. Some departments re-examined their policies on responding to 911 calls involving children, trying to balance caution with humanity. These changes marked a shift in power. The public's voice now held influence over institutions previously insulated from scrutiny. Yet, the reforms were uneven. Some cities moved faster than others. Policies existed on paper, but human judgment remained fallible. Fear, bias, and cultural assumptions continued to play a role in split-second decisions, leaving the audience with an unsettling realization. Change was possible, but not guaranteed. The Rice family's civil suit against the city, resulting in a $6 million settlement, offered some recognition of responsibility. But the settlement could not resurrect a life stolen in an instant, nor could it erase the grief carried by a family forced to endure the nation's gaze while mourning. For many, the settlement represented a small measure of justice, but for others, it underscored the limits of a system that could compensate financially but could never restore life or innocence. Tamir Rice's story became a touchstone in national conversations about racial injustice and police accountability. Activists cited his name alongside other young black victims, and his death became a symbol of what can go wrong when fear outweighs humanity. Social media campaigns, documentaries, and protests amplified his story, ensuring that the lessons from Cleveland reached far beyond the city's borders. His name became synonymous with a struggle that spanned decades. The fight to value life over assumption, innocence over suspicion, and children over the impulse to perceive threat. Yet, the tension remained. Dramatic irony persisted. Awareness had grown, reforms were discussed, but systemic change was slow. Every new report of a child misjudged, every viral video of an officer's split-second action, reminded the public that the fight was ongoing. Tamir Rice's legacy was a powerful lens through which these tragedies were examined, but it was also a painful reminder that visibility alone could not prevent death. The system structures were resilient, procedural protections shielding authority even in the face of moral outrage. Despite this, a subtle power shift had taken hold. Authority now operated under a watchful public eye. Cameras, citizen oversight, and social media ensured that actions were scrutinized in ways previously impossible. This shift altered behavior. Officers hesitated, departments reviewed incidents more carefully, and policymakers were pressured to act. Tamir Rice, though gone, wielded influence that extended beyond life. His death forced a reckoning that could not be ignored. The emotional weight of the story peaks when considering Tamir as a child. 12 years old, playing, living, and imagining, a boy whose life was judged in a fraction of a moment. The audience is drawn into his innocence, his humanity, and the unfairness of the system that could perceive him as dangerous before anyone else had a chance to recognize who he was. This tension, sorrow, and grief create an immersive emotional hook, compelling viewers to reflect, question, and demand accountability. The narrative's power lies not only in what happened, but in what continues to unfold. Policies may be updated. Officers may be retrained. Systems may evolve. But the work is ongoing, unfinished, and fragile. Every generation faces the challenge of internalizing the lessons of Tamir Rice's death. How to value innocence, recognize bias, and prevent unnecessary loss of life. The stakes are unmistakable, and the responsibility is collective. Part 5 also underscores the life lesson. Justice is not merely reactive, it is preventive. True justice requires vigilance, empathy, and systemic reform. Witnessing wrongdoing is not enough. Societal structures must be reshaped to ensure that children, particularly those who are vulnerable or marginalized, are not judged as threats before humanity has a chance to intervene. Tamir's story teaches the audience that accountability extends beyond verdicts. It includes awareness, advocacy, and the courage to confront institutional failure. The climax of this part is a reflective one. The audience is invited to consider the enduring impact of Tamir Rice. His story shaped policy debates, inspired movements, and challenged societal assumptions about race, childhood, and authority. Yet the unresolved tension, how to fully prevent the next tragedy, remains. Dramatic irony lingers. The child whose life ended in seconds continues to teach lessons decades later, forcing society to act in ways that are slow, imperfect, but necessary. The final emotional moments linger on the personal. Photographs of Tamir, smiling, running, holding his toy gun, remind the audience of what was lost. His playground, once full of laughter, now exists as a symbol of potential cut short. The Rice family's grief remains, their advocacy continues, and the nation's conscience is unsettled. Tamir Rice's life and death demand more than remembrance. They demand change, vigilance, and an unflinching examination of societal bias. As the story closes, the suspense remains. The work of justice is ongoing. Awareness has grown, reforms have been enacted, but the possibility of future tragedy looms. The audience is left with a haunting question. If one child's life could reveal the flaws in the system, how many more will it take before society fully protects its most vulnerable? Tamir Rice's story, Part 5, concludes not with closure, but with responsibility. It challenges viewers to act, to advocate, and to insist that policies, practices, and culture align with the fundamental principle. Every child is human first, innocent until proven otherwise, deserving of safety and care. His legacy endures not as a case file, but as a moral imperative, a call to ensure that no child ever again is judged as a threat before they are seen as a human being. And the ultimate cliffhanger remains, a question for society. If visibility, outrage, and policy reform are not enough to prevent the next tragedy, what must we do differently to honor Tamir Rice, and every child whose life is vulnerable to assumptions, fear, and systemic bias?